Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Soulcast Media live event. It is so wonderful to see everybody. Before we get started, if everybody can see me and can hear me okay, can you give me a thumbs up on your end or just type in yes in the chat if you can see me? With tech, sometimes you just never know. But even though it seems all right on my end, I just want to get a good temperature check. If everyone can see me and hear me, just give me a thumbs up. But first of all, welcome everybody to this event. I'm so thrilled that we're here to talk about strategic communication skills. Now, behind the scenes, I was commenting and chatting with many of you, and how amazing is this? We have folks from all over the world here in the States, in the US, but of course, internationally as well. And that's one of the best things I think about doing an event like this. We can truly draw in people. And I guarantee today is going to be an action packed event where my guest and we're going to be sharing with you all these amazing communications tips because my guest is also a communications expert. Now, I wanted to let you know this event, yes, we are live. We're broadcasting to you live. I'm actually here in California right now. So it's like our, early, late morning or so. But this event is for you, meaning if you have any questions as my guest and I are chatting, we want you to be a part of this experience, meaning, you have the chat function here. So, if you're like, hey, Jessica or Dory, if I do have a question, put it into the chat function and we will do our best to try to answer any questions that you have because we want you to know that this event is for you. And you're probably here because you're like, yeah, I want to be perhaps more strategic in my communication skills, whether it's speaking up in meetings, pitching your idea, heck, public speaking. How do I formulate my message? We're going to be talking about it all, but also thinking about long term goals. That's something very important. But also, how does communications play into that, including people's perception of you and the amazing work that you're doing? So that's what today is about. For those of you who are just meeting me for the first time, I'll do a quick intro. So, my name is Jessica Chen, and I'm the founder and CEO of Soulcast Media, and we do specialize in communications. So, we work with Fortune 100 companies, we train them. I do a lot of speaking as well, and I love it. Prior to Soulcast Media, I used to be a former journalist. So I was working all over the states here, New York, San Diego. And it's funny because when I started working as a journalist, I tell folks this all the time. Communications was not something I was good at. You know, part of it I think is a bit personality, part of it I think is cultural. Communications growing up at home, it was not something that was constantly reiterated in that sense where my parents, for example, they never would be like, Jessica, you got to speak up. They would never say things like that. In fact, it was always the opposite, where it was like, you know what, just put your head down, do the work, and just do it well. And as you can imagine, I think many of us can feel this, when you work, when you start working, you're like, wow, communicating and communicating well is actually very important. Yes, you got to work hard, but that's only half of it. You got to be able to talk about it so people see it. So, long story short, after about 10 years in news and learning all the communications tips and tricks, I decided to start Soulcast Media. And we've been around for about 5 years now, which is absolutely amazing. So, without further ado, I'm excited. Let's get started. I'm excited to introduce my guest. So you might have seen her around. She's here on LinkedIn and she is amazing. Her name is Dorie Clark and and I have a whole list of all the amazing work that I want to do, but I'm also going to have her introduce herself. But from a high level, she's one of the top business thinkers. She is a communications coach. So you are all here at the right place for communications. She's also an author, as well as she teaches at Columbia Business School. So let me pull up Dorie. Hey, Dorie.
Hi, Jessica. So glad to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. And, thank you so much for joining. Everybody here knows we're talking about communications. And I know I did a quick intro of who you are. And it was funny behind the scenes. I was like, Dorie, how do you have time? You're just so busy. But, Dorie, let the folks know who you are and the work you do. I know I did a quick intro already.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Jessica. My most recent book is The Long Game: How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in a Short-Term World. And for the purposes of this conversation, one of the most salient things is that early on, before I started my own business, which I've run for for 18 years now. I actually worked both as a print journalist and also as a presidential campaign spokesperson. I worked in politics for a while. I was a press secretary on a governor's race. I was the New Hampshire communications director for a presidential campaign. And so we wrote speeches, we briefed candidates, and really worked on questions of messaging and how to and make sure that what you were intending to say was what was getting through. And that's something that I think matters for all of us these days.
It's funny because I love how you also shared your experience. And even though you were more or less already in the communication space too, I think a lot, and I'm sure a lot of what you learned on the job, it's applicable to professionals in any environment. And I love what you said about, intention versus how it actually lands. And I'm thinking you think about this a lot because being intentional, but also how it's perceived are kind of two different things, right? We can try to be very intentional about it, but how is that coming across? So, if you're okay with it, Dory, I just want to get into this. I have so many questions for you.
Let's do it. Let's totally do it.
And I'm sure our audience, by the way, like I said, if you have any questions for Dory and I, throw them in the chat. So, number one, let's talk about communications from a high level and kind of talking about what we just said earlier. I think many of us here, we're working professionals. We go into work, we're doing good work and we want people to know about it. Okay. Because, like I said earlier, doing good work is only half it. It's really about being able to talk about it. So, Dory, for folks who are like, well, how do I make sure people understand? How do I make sure my message lands? How do I know people get it? What do you normally tell folks?
Okay, so this is something, and I love this question, Jessica, and I'm very excited about your forthcoming book too, which is dealing with so many of these really important questions. This is something I talked about a lot, actually, in my first book, Reinventing You. A problem that a lot of people have with anything sort of redolent of personal branding is that if you're not used to it, if this is not a modality that you're naturally comfortable with, oftentimes people basically create a straw man and they say, oh, well, if I were to do personal branding, if I were to sort of talk more about my accomplishments, it means that I would become, and then, insert this image of like the most sleazy, awful, self-promoting car salesman guy in the world. And so quite logically, they say, well, I don't want to be that. And so it gives them permission to not do any of the things that actually they know in their hearts are important for making sure that people know about it. There's just this kind of easy polarization, which gives people too many excuses to not think about self-promotion at all. And so what I really want to emphasize is we can't get away with creating some kind of fake straw man that, oh, I don't want to be like that, because there are lots of ways to be informative without being oleaginous. There are lots of ways to educate people about what you're doing and be helpful rather than be chest thumping. We have to find them. We have to find the way that's comfortable for us, but it doesn't mean that you have to turn into some kind of, evil person that you don't want to be.
Mhm. I love what you said about the straw man because in some ways it's this image or this idea that we have in our head of like, oh, but if I do this, I am that sleazy salesman. I want to come off as too salesy, which is true, right? Many of us were hyper aware when somebody is trying to like sell or they're showing off, and immediately our radar goes off, and we're just like, oh, okay, well, okay, sure, whatever, right? Like we may
Totally.
naturally
And
just
no
kind of.
one likes that, right? That's the crucial thing. Like literally no one likes that. That might be doing personal branding, but it's doing personal branding badly. It's just that's a visible example because it's like so egregious.
It is. And in many ways, I wish I heard this message early on too, because I would immediately default to what you're saying. Well, it's like, and then I would give myself those excuses like, well, but if I talk about my work, are people going to think I'm trying to show off? So let me just like not say anything, right? Like I would tell myself these things. But then, okay, then the question is, and you said this already, it's like, it's trying to be as helpful as possible. But what does that even mean? And I wonder if we can even break it down in certain contexts. Like, what are some of the questions maybe we can ask ourselves so we can crystallize that message? So, like, the folks who are listening, I'm sure you're all thinking right now, like, yo, yeah, maybe I did just finish this one project. How can I make sure other people know about it? So what are some of the things that we can ask to make sure we get it right?
Yeah. So, okay. One of my very favorite tips, this to me is like the lowest of low hanging fruits, is that when you are running into someone that you haven't talked to for a while, which is a situation that happens literally all the time, inevitably there is going to be some moment where they ask you a variation of, so what have you been working on? What have you been up to? I mean, we know that this question is going to come, and yet almost no one prepares for it. And so somehow we freeze and we freak out, and in the moment, we kind of come up with some random thing. Oh, I just got my dog groomed, or like just something random. And it's usually not so helpful. But so, what I want to challenge people to do is to actually be more thoughtful about that. If there is something that you actually accomplished recently that you're proud of, if there is a way that you would like to be seen that is maybe different than you are now. Like you want to move up in leadership. So you have determined that it would be important for you to be viewed as, say, more strategic, for instance. Maybe you pick something to talk about that emphasizes that maybe you were just working on the team strategy committee or, whatever it is, but you pick something that helps lead you in the direction of where you want to go and how you want to be seen. And the really important thing here is people asked you this question. This is not you bragging. This is not you self-promoting. This is you answering a question that is going to come anyway. So it's just a natural conversational discourse. No one is going to hold it against you or think badly of you because you have an answer to a question that they asked you.
I love that because in many ways you're saying that it's being prepared. It's almost anticipating that that question is going to be asked, especially if maybe I mean, yeah, it could be in a meeting, at a networking situation, whatever it is. But what I love about what you said, and this is what I want to highlight, is you're being strategic and tailored with how you answer that question because I feel how you answer that question should be a little bit different depending on who's actually asking you that question. And sometimes we don't think about that too much. We're just like, "Oh yeah, I'm working on this project." And then that's kind of like your blanket statement. But what about that project matters to person A? What about that project matters to person B? And just having that and it can be even just like 10 seconds of just like, "Oh, okay, I know I'm going into this meeting. This is who's going to be here. Make sure to talk about this," right? And it's just like giving yourself that pep talk ahead of time can really, yeah, crystallize that message of knowing, okay, just make sure I like subtly drop that, right? And I know for some of us, we're just like, we don't even give ourselves the time to even think about that. But every chance to talk about your work, like when somebody asks, "What are you up to?" That's a chance for you to make an impression, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that.
So when so okay, for those, Dory, who and this is I think I saw this in the comments, it's like, well, what if people feel uncomfortable? Like what if it's more of like that humbleness? And this is where, I definitely want to share my thoughts and because I feel like a lot of this comes from like the cultural values that I was taught myself of like you don't talk about yourself. Like you don't put yourself out there. You don't want to like yes, boast or whatever. Like what is that like mental shift that you would kind of like encourage folks to think about when they're just like it is so uncomfortable and maybe I feel like my team won't be so like happy about it or whatever it is.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of important points here, and it is useful to try to viscerally sort of adjust your thinking, right? Because I mean, everybody who is part of this conversation understands intellectually that, like, gosh, yes, I guess it would be a good thing if more people knew what I could do, right? Like, presumably, we're all in agreement about that. The issue is that we would like that to happen magically and I mean, sometimes it does, right? Sometimes we luck out because someone really is paying attention and they notice. That's amazing. Sometimes we luck out because a friend or a colleague, like says something and mentions it for us. That's a terrific mitzvah when people do that. So it can happen and that's great. But the truth is, and I think this is like a hard truth that we have to acknowledge, most people out there are not paying any degree of attention to us. And the amount that they care is kind of exceedingly close to zero. Like, unless it's literally your boss who's supervising you, and sometimes not even then, they are not paying attention. And so it almost is like a form of reverse hubris for people to think like, oh, well, they should notice. Like, oh, really? They're going to pay that much attention to you, when they're like not paying attention to anything else. I mean, fundamentally, the way that I like to think about this is number one, the more power and influence you have, the more you can help other people, the more you can help your team, the more you can advocate. If you are, let's say a team leader, if your team is getting credit for things, this enables you to help support the career aspirations of every single person on your team. Hopefully you're going to get more resources as a result of that, which can do really good things for your mission and for the people who work for you. But also for you individually, it's powerful because you're actually not able to give your all if people don't understand what your all is. And so, making people aware, like, oh, actually, I know that software. I could be helpful. I've done things in the past with it. Or, oh, I'm so glad we were able to accomplish X, Y, Z. Well, the fact that they know about that, they literally might not even have noticed. And so, if they say, oh, wow, you were actually able to, decrease subscriber turnover by 20%. How did you do that? That could be data that is really useful in the rest of the company. And so it enables you to help on a broader scale. And I think those are important things that we need to home in on.
Hone in on, and I think it's just knowing that sometimes talking about the amazing work that we're all doing is it doesn't sometimes even have to be as explicit as we think it needs to be. Sometimes it can be extremely subtle. It can just be like a one-line sentence in an email. It can just be like, hey, I want to give you a quick update on this project. And it's not necessarily expecting a response or even a validation. It's just knowing that you dropped your 2 cents and people read it and then they can like move on. But you know that these subtle cues, subtle, dropping of hints of like, oh, I did this, I finished that, this is going great. Like even just sometimes having those like positive words in a sentence or two about like what you're working on, sometimes that's all is needed to get people to have and start to form that impression of you that you can get things done. I was chuckling because when you were talking about how doing good work and it's like, does anybody see it? I don't know why I was thinking of this analogy, but I was thinking about how this is a crazy analogy because I don't even do this really, but like basketball, right? And it's sometimes I'll go to the basketball court with my son. He's 2, and we'll have him play basketball. And while we're there, I'll sometimes take the basketball and maybe I'll like try to like shoot one hoop. And it's kind of like one of those things where you get it in and you look around, you're like, did anybody see that? You know what I mean? It's the same analogy of like, I just did that. I got it in. And maybe because like I never get it in. So when I do get it in, I'm like, did you see that? So it's kind of, I was just laughing. I don't know why I was thinking of that analogy, but it's similar, right? It's like you're doing something great. It's cool, whatever. But do other people see it, right?
Yeah, I love that. That's so fun. I think that's really cool. And it's important to understand the context too, right? Like I think most of us would, perhaps rightly recoil from a situation where, it just felt like apropos of nothing. We were sort of dropping in like, hey, by the way, did you know that I increased top line revenue by X amount? Like I mean, of
Yep.
course, that's like it's random, it's bragging, it's like, okay, great, good for you, and like it just
Mhm.
feels weird. The crucial thing here is context. If you're talking about you're having a group discussion about how do we increase revenue in our division, it is actually incredibly relevant for you in that moment to say, gosh, our team has had some success here, we were able to do blah blah blah. If anyone wants to talk about that further, I'd be happy to share what we learned.
Mhm.
I mean, that's extremely relevant. It's extremely helpful. Again, no one is going to say, "Oh, I can't believe that person was bragging so much,"
Mhm.
because there is a context to it.
What you just said is a great example, and I know folks have have the questions now of like, but how do I do it? I mean, Dora, you just gave a great example. It's using even past wins, past accomplishments, and saying that in the beginning of your sentence of saying, well, actually, you all, we have done this. When we did this last quarter, this is what we saw. And you just in some ways giving context, educating folks is you talking about something that and people see that. One of the other tips that I was thinking about is when we do something great. right? And we want to make sure people know about it. It's maybe even proactively offering it as like, hey boss, I just finished this project. It went really well. Would it be okay if I, just like did a 5-minute presentation to talk about it? You offering something like that to give somebody an update to talk about it with the team. I'm sure your manager will be like, "Oh yeah, yeah, why don't you share with the team like, what happened on this project?" So, even proactively creating opportunities for yourself, that's one thing to think about too.
Yeah, that's such a great idea. I love that.
So one of the things that I wanted to pivot was I wanted to talk about your book too, Dory, which is The Long Game, which by the way, I have to say, I love that title because instantly people are like, yeah, like, I get it. Okay, so then the question is, in the book The Long Game, and now because we're talking about strategic communication skills, I'm sure there's a lot of overlap of like thinking long term. But from those for those who haven't been able to read your book, from a high level, what is the long game? What does that even mean? How can they think about it, and why is it so important to their work?
Yeah. So, I mean, the long game, sometimes people are like, well, how long precisely? And of course, we can be flexible about this, but broadly, the way that I think about it is, whatever is long term for you. If it could be 10 years, it could be 20 years, it could be you thinking, from now to the end of your career, but it's essentially looking at the outcome that you want to achieve and working backwards and saying, all right, there are obviously in life a lot of short-term pressures. Oh, I need to get this done today. And it could be because, your boss is riding you for something and that's real. It could be because internally we feel bad sometimes. Oh, well, I saw that my friend, got promoted before I did. And so what's wrong with me? I need to pick up the pace or something like that. So, we have a lot of things driving us for short-term stuff. But in the long game, I really try to make the case that, well, that is real, and we have to sometimes play along to a certain extent, to keep our job and whatever. I mean, we all understand email is not inherently important. It's not like, oh wow, I really succeeded in my career, I nailed email. But also you can't afford to ignore email. Like that will be a problem too. But the question is, how do you balance things out and make choices so that, yes, you do what is necessary in the short term, so that you can keep the ball moving, but you keep your eye on the long term prize? Because it's conceivable that we could end up with all our professional dreams coming true if we just go day to day from one task to another, but it's frankly not that likely because you're not driving the car, you're being driven. And so I want us to steer a little bit more and have a little bit more agency in what we're aiming towards. We don't have perfect control, but we often have more control than we think, and to me that's what the long game is about.
And I love your acknowledgement of how sometimes it's hard to think about the long game when we get boggled down by the little things, the things that make us feel a certain way, meaning I'm so stressed, I'm so anxious, I'm so unhappy. Like, it's those like feelings that again, like you mentioned, are very real in a workplace, but that sometimes, and I know I'm guilty of that. Sometimes it's easy to just kind of like spiral and be like, oh my gosh, this is not working the way I want it to go. This sucks. Like, what do I do? I feel stuck. Right. And then the problem though is like you're just thinking in that just kind of like immediate because you're in that feeling of that negativity, right? So in some ways I love how you kind of acknowledge that it's kind of two different things. It's like, yes, maybe this does suck. Maybe the current situation is not right. Maybe this project or working with this client is like the worst experience of your life, right? But it's like, no, let's think a bit further. Okay. So then Dory, I have to ask then in that situation, how can people reframe? Because while it is so easy to dwell, while it's so easy to just, focus on the negativity, the sucky things, right? How can people switch and be like, wait a second, let me think strategically now?
So, a great piece of research that I often come back to is some research that has been done by Teresa Amabile at the Harvard Business School and her husband Stephen Kramer, and they wrote about it in a book called The Progress Principle. And they were studying this question of employee engagement, right? What is it that makes people feel connected to and excited about their work? And what they discovered was that it's actually a fairly simple equation which is that the people who felt the best about their work, the happiest, the most engaged, were the people who made progress, even incredibly small progress, every day towards something that they considered a worthy goal. That's the key here. If you are spending 90% of your time on stuff that you consider just, you know, stupidity, right? That's not ideal, clearly. It's not really what we want for you. But if you can carve out, a space for yourself, the 5%, the 10%, even if it's after you go home from work at night and you spend 10 minutes writing your screenplay that's your big dream or whatever it is, that is moving the ball forward. It's not so much about, oh, it has to be fast, it has to be now. We have to recognize, all of us recognize, that there are times in our lives where it will go slower than others. If you're caring for a sick relative, if you've got, some newborn at home, if you, get COVID or whatever it is, you are not going to be making as much professional progress during those times as you would like. Like that's just reality. But it doesn't mean that you have to make no progress. You can find a small way to keep the ball moving forward. And that's the thing that often keeps people going and gives them a feeling of momentum in some way.
I love that. And I almost want to, throw this question back at our audience who's watching and listening. It's like, if we asked you, what is something that you've been wanting to do? What is something that has, secretly excited you, or maybe not so secret, excited you that you've been like, I have been curious about learning a little bit more of that, or maybe exploring that. And, just like what Dory said, it's giving yourself the 5, 10, hey, maybe 20 minutes to just work on that one thing, and just knowing that those minutes, right? We'll just say minutes, not even hours, because heck, we might not even have hours to do, right? But just giving ourselves those minutes of a day to chip away at it, you kind of feel like you're making that progress. It actually reminds me, personally, when I was many years ago, when I was a reporter, and this is when I was in New York, I was we call them like a general assignment reporter. So I basically covered everything and anything. But deep down inside, I've always wanted to cover business news. Like I was very fascinated with like business. And I remember at the time when I was working, there was no opportunity for me to cover business news. We were a small television station. Everybody had to do everything. But I knew if I wanted my resume, right? If I knew I wanted my resume to say, or at least say some sort of like business expert, I had to find that time to create those opportunities for myself. So I remember at the end of the day, after like an 8, 9 hour workday, when I would get home, I would tell myself, well, Jessica, at least try to research some sort of business story that you could pitch. And that consistency, so that every morning when I would walk into that editorial meeting, I would at least intentionally try to pitch one business story, so that soon after people would then begin to associate me with like, oh, Jessica always has these business stories, right? And then when one would come in, then they would give it to me. So that was just an example of saying how, even though your job description may not be ideal, maybe you're doing work that doesn't completely excite you, there are still things you can do behind the scenes that you can maybe present at work that can get people to start to associate you with what you want your, I call it like career brand, like what you want your career brand to be. Do you have a similar story, Dory? I don't know if, or did you always just get like, "Hey, I wanna do this," and it immediately happens? Do you have like a story or something that you can share with folks where you're like, "Yeah, I did have to show or prove that this is what I wanted?"
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic, Jessica. I love that story. Well, it actually reminds me of something in my book Reinventing You. I profiled this guy Richard, and he was and I mean, interestingly, it was a little bit of a reverse. He was a business reporter, and it wasn't like they gave him stuff that was really not super sexy. He was an oil and gas reporter for a
Mm,
while, and then he was doing mortgage-backed securities, and honestly, neither one was super thrilling to him. But his organization that he worked for had started. They made an announcement that they were going to start doing like hospitality coverage,
mm,
and he's like, "By hospitality, do you mean food and wine?" And they said, "Well, yes." And he said, like, "I will do it for free." He's like, "You don't even have to pay me extra, but can I do this?" And so for him, the way that he was able to take the job that was not so fun for him and
Mhm.
actually make it meaningful was that, I mean, it did mean, frankly, that for a while he was doing extra work, but it was extra work that he loved because they would send him to like food and wine festivals and he'd get to write about them. And for him, that lit him up and he sought out those specific opportunities.
That's a perfect example of, again, kind of like similar. It's like, yes, you have to put in the extra work. Yes, you might have to do it for free, but at least you're doing something that excites you, interests you, because sometimes that's kind of like what is needed, right? So we have a real, I want to get to this one question that I see because I do think it's important, especially when we're thinking about the long game and kind of getting your name out there, getting people to recognize you and things like that. And that has to do with straight up networking. And do we have to do it? How do we do it? Is it good? Is it bad? I am sort of like I have like mixed feelings sometimes about networking. I don't always love it, but I know sometimes it's necessary. But Dory, what are your thoughts on is networking part of the long game here?
I mean, yes, and I have many thoughts about it, but I'm curious, Jessica, what are you talking about when you're talking about networking? Like how do you meet people? What does networking mean for you?
So when and I know there's many ways we can take this question, but the one that I think and I'm most interested in getting your thoughts on are even networking internally. Okay. Like let's say like we're not going to the happy hours, like we're not trying to go to like an industry event where there's like a bunch of like new folks. Like let's just say like internally, right? Where we're like, you know what? I'm in let's say I'm in compliance, right? Like and I sit in compliance, that's like my team of like 10 people, but is it important for me to get to know folks in strategy? Is it important for me to get to know the engineering team, the sales team, the marketing team? Is it important? Is it part of the long game? Like, how should somebody think about this? Or is it just okay to just stick within your immediate team and just kind of like have those relationships there?
So, I mean, I would say, like, when people ask, like, is it okay? I would say it is often it is often sufficient, but but that is not really the path to either workplace triumph or to the kind of safety, frankly, that we want. Right? I mean, if we acknowledge that we live in a world where there's not a lot of job security, there's not a lot of career security, where security comes from, it's certainly not that like, oh yeah, I'm going to be at my company for 30 years. Like you might, but that is definitely the exception these days rather than the rule. And so if we think about how to make our own careers more secure, it comes from the relationships that we have with people because if something happens in your company, in your industry, it can be very precarious if you've put all your eggs in one basket. I mean, in fact, in Reinventing You, I tell a story about a guy named Dan that worked at a company and he had worked there for 10 years. It was kind of a big company. And one day, I mean, who knows what sparked it, but he just woke up and he had this kind of realization. He's like, oh, he hadn't been prioritizing networking and he realized like, oh my gosh, pretty much literally everyone I know besides my neighbor is someone who works at this company. And that's not to say that's a bad thing, but it actually becomes a kind of frightening thing if your company starts to have layoffs. And then all of a sudden, if you get laid off and everyone else also is laid off, well, who's going to help you then? Right. So for him, it was a wake up call to network more outside his company. So that's important. But yeah, especially inside, that matters too, frankly. I tell a story in this book, Standout, which was done by Portfolio, which is your publisher as well, about a woman that I knew who did something really simple, which frankly anyone can do, which is that she just decided, okay, I'm going to devote an hour a week to networking. That seems totally doable. I can do an hour. And her version of that was that inside her company, she decided that she would have a coffee or a lunch once a week with someone in a different part of the company. And this is like, people like whatever, you're in a big meeting with 20 people and you kind of know them a little bit, but you don't know them that well. And she's like, you know what? Next week, I'll just ask somebody to lunch. And it's a wonderful way to actually really find out what is happening in the company, get more ideas, get more allies. And if something's going wrong, whatever, they're not processing your request or something, you have people you can actually call to be like, hey, can you go to the person next to you and be like, what's going on? And it was dramatically effective. So, yes, I am a big networking fan.
I love that. It reminds me of a story that I also wrote in my book, which is not out yet. It comes out in the summer, but the book is called Smart, Not Loud. And in the book, I talk about I have a story of she's actually one of my friends about so she's an attorney. So went to law school, the top law school in the country, graduated with a, from a good school. But when she started working, which was at the time in corporate law, she realized that she was among thousands of great young lawyers who had just graduated from law school, right? And I think at the time it might have been around the time of the recession, 08, 09, whatnot. And I remember she was telling me how it clicked to her one day where she realized I could just be chopped like anybody here. But what is my differentiating factor? Like, what is that differentiating factor going to be? Because yes, I can read well, I can write well, I can write email well, right? Like, but these are like given, right? These are expected. Like, that's not going to differentiate you from another brilliant attorney. And that's what she was telling me. So for her, she started getting strategic. She was like, I need to show the intangible skills that are, you can't necessarily teach this to people. You just got to like learn it yourself. And we're talking intangible skills like the people you know, networking, communications, right? Connecting the dots, things like that, that again, it's beyond the books now. It's just like even telling your employer, like, hey, I'm going to be, I was invited to speak at this event. Do you want to join me? Right. And just like dropping little things like that shows that you're not, and for her, you're not just an attorney. You're an attorney who can offer this, that, the intangible stuff in many ways. So I love that example, and I share it in my book, Smart Not Loud, because I think it's a good way to think about work is just work in many ways. Like you got to deliver, you got to do it. But sometimes it's like, again, the intangibles, the networking. Who do you know? Who knows you? Right. And that kind of stuff. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's all this weight, networking is such a fraught concept for people, but at a really basic level, I mean, yes, we can get incrementally more strategic as things progress, but for starters, it's just literally like, okay, if you're at a big company, do people know who you are? Because if it's time for layoffs and they're like, who the heck is Jessica? Have I even met Jessica? Like, sure, let's get rid of Jessica. I guess she doesn't make much of an impression around here if I don't know who she is.
yeah.
That's a very different conversation than like, oh gosh, we have to pick people to lay off. And it's like, oh, Jessica. Oh, but Jessica's so great. I mean, yeah, she's always doing blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Oh man, things would be really different around here without her. Like that literally can mean the difference between job and no job is just do people know who you are. And so taking the time to like have that coffee, make that connection, have that conversation can really make a remarkably big difference.
Absolutely. So, I have to say, I mean, the time is flying, and I feel like you and I can keep going and whatnot. But and I can't believe it. But as we start to wrap up here, Dory, and I want to say for folks who are here and listening, I hope you're enjoying this conversation as much as I am. Dory, I hope you're enjoying this conversation. This is just so much fun. But as we start to wrap up here, and we talked about so many things, right? Like communications, the long game, networking, like how to rethink, how we talk about ourselves. We talked about so much. And yes, this is all going to be on replay. You can watch it again on LinkedIn, or it's going to be on our podcast. You can just go to any Spotify, Apple, whatever, wherever you listen. Just type in communicating confidently with Jessica Chen, and this episode will be there. But as we start to wrap up here, Dory, I call them golden nuggets, but like if there were any, like maybe like one or two things you'd want our audience, our listeners to walk away with after listening and watching this about communications, about strategy, about the long game, what would that be? Anything that they could use immediately?
Well, I think one of the most important points, Jessica, is one that you are underlining and really talking about in your book, which is just basically we shouldn't make excuses for ourselves with this. I mean, this is important stuff. I often get asked to talk about networking as an introvert or communicating as an introvert, which I am. I'm definitely an introvert. And a lot of times, people will literally, when they're asking questions, they'll like start out, they'll raise their hand and be like, well, I'm an introvert, so I can't dot, dot, dot. And it's like, oh, come on. Yes, of course you can. Things
Mhm.
are different as introverts sort of in the same way that it is being left-handed. Like, yes, I understand and I don't like it that society and business professional life is optimized for extroverts. That is annoying. It's kind of unfair, but like whatever. Okay. And so if you are right-handed, things are easier for you because things are optimized for the majority. But it doesn't mean that left-handed people can get away with just saying like, "Oh, I will never cut a document with scissors. Sorry, I don't do that because I'm left-handed." It's like you find a way.
Yeah.
And similarly, if you're an introvert, it's a question. You don't have to do it the standard way, but you have to do it. You find your way. For me, it's about I don't go to the big networking events anymore. I have my own. I have my own small events. I like them. They're nice. They're nice for everybody, and it's a way that I can do it. And similarly for you, if you grow up, as you talk about, in a quiet culture,
Mhm.
or a place where self promotion or personal branding or speaking up is not sort of heralded as a virtue. That doesn't mean that people are permanently excused from learning those skills.
Yeah.
It means that you might do it a different way, or that you need to sort of find your way into it. But I think it's really important that you're teaching people to not be passive and sort of accept the like, oh, I can't do it line, but instead helping people find a path to the way that they can do it.
Yes, 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 and I have to say I'm a huge introvert too, and I think people are always surprised, like, if you're introvert, why are you talking about communications? But that's the thing, just because we are introverted, it doesn't mean we can't, lean into learning these skills and becoming better at it. And similar to you, Dory, those big networking events, oh my gosh, even though we talk about communications, sometimes it's hard for me to communicate in big networking situations. It's like it's just so awkward sometimes. Like there's no other way to say it. It's just really awkward.
It's super awkward. Yeah. I choose not to go to them. I just literally don't anymore. But the way that I'm able to give myself permission is that there are plenty of other things that I do instead.
Yeah, and which is what you said, like you create your own events where it's maybe a small group, so it helps, the introverted side of you to better like enjoy it if anything, right?
Yeah.
So super helpful and I think one of the things that I would say, as we wrap up here, which is crazy, but it's just really thinking that everything that we talked about, strategic communication skills, talking about your wins, networking, like all those things, these are things that yes, in many ways, you're like, well, how do I even think about this on top of my work? Like, I got family, I got kids, like, whatever, right? And, I don't think anything Dory and I are talking about are like grand things that you have to like truly like be spending so much time on. I think a lot of it is just consciously being aware, like, yeah, let me think about this a little bit differently. Sometimes, and I love doing this, like I always have post-it notes all around my desk, but like it's just like if I need to remember something or just keep it top of mind, I'll always write it down so I can see it. So this is to say everything Dory and I talked about, it's getting you to like think about work a little bit differently. Most of us are working like full-time jobs, again, are working professionals, but it's like how can we show up a little bit differently, especially if it's not something that we're used to, like talking about yourself. So I hope this talk was encouraging for many of you to think about your work. And I know this time just flew by, but Dory, how can people get connected with you? Tell us about what are the many books that you have, and yes, where can they find you too?
Well, thank you so much, Jessica. It's been great talking with you. Yeah, if folks want to learn more, that would be amazing. We've been talking especially about my book Reinventing You, that touches on a lot of these themes about personal branding and communication. You can get it at fine bookstores all over. But I'll especially direct you to doryclark.com/reinvent, which is a free download that is the Reinventing You self-assessment. So thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you, Dory. And again, thank you all so much for tuning in. And just so you know, I host these events every other week, and I always have a fantastic guest come on. And similarly, we talk about all things communications and career. So if you're interested in staying up to date and getting alerts of like the events that we have coming up, go to our website, soulcastmedia.com, get on our newsletter because that's how we communicate with you all too. So with that, thank you, Dory, so much for joining. And thank you all for joining us. And if there's any questions that we didn't get to answer, feel free to message us and we'll try to do our best to also answer it. So with that, thank you, everyone. Take care.